Well, welcome back, everybody. In our next session for WSA, we will take a look at initialization of the appliance. I want to show you how to configure basic settings so we can get the WSA up and running and prepared for some more advanced configuration. As we will see, the initialization process is going to be generally performed using the GUI. When you log in to the WSA for the first time, it is going to automatically activate a setup wizard for you. And this is what most people use to initialize the proxy, even those advanced users who know how to access individual settings from the GUI. Because as we will see, what you can do with a wizard, you can also do through the GUI. You will just have to know how to access a particular option. Okay, if we are dealing with a physical appliance, the management port of this device is pre-configured. It uses IP address 192.168.42.42, so we can just plug in your PC, put it into the same subnet. It is going to be /24, give it a different address, and connect to the appliance over port 8080. And this is the default HTTP port the management interface listens on, or you can also go for 8443, which is HTTPS. Remember that management interface settings can be also easily changed using the command line. You can access the interface using SSH, so this is assuming that you can reach IP address configured on M1, or you can go for the console connection. Maybe you just unpacked WSA, you took it out of the box. This would be a perfect moment to connect to the proxy for the physical cable and possibly change some of the management settings using the CLI. Now, the WSA's command line is gonna be somewhat similar to what we used to see on iOS, but in the same time, there are also gonna be a couple differences because of the fact that WSA technically uses a different operating system. It is not iOS, it is Async OS, what's installed on the proxy. And Async OS is basically a hardened version of a Linux system. Okay, so as we will see, stuff that is going to be the same on Async OS, it is going to be the basic navigation for the CLI. Tab for command completion, maybe Control-C to break the process, to stop execution of a command. This stuff is going to be the same. Now, what is going to change is going to be the way of providing keywords or just arguments to the main command syntax. Now, what we used to do on iOS was to issue a command and specify a bunch of arguments. Like, for example, show was the command and an IP route were the arguments. Now, with WSA, we will, in most cases, deal with just one command with the main configuration statement, which is gonna automatically get us to the so-called interactive mode, which is more of like a set of menus with a bunch of options that we will be able to use to configure a given setting. So this stuff was also available on iOS for a small number of commands, like for example, auto secure. On the WSA, most of the commands are going to be using this type of syntax. And then the other major difference from iOS is that the configuration changes must be approved and must be committed with the aid of the commit configuration statement so they take effect. So what it means is that when you make some changes to the configuration using either CLI or the GUI, because the commit statement applies to the CLI and the GUI as well, they won't affect the device until you eventually approve them. This concept is obviously different from regular iOS-based devices like distribution layer switches, like access layer switches, like your G1, G2 ISRs. It's much more similar to what you can see on the ASR platforms. So just to quickly show you this, we will take a look at the WSA CLI. I'm going to say question mark and hit the enter key. And it is going to show us all commands available on this particular code. And those commands are generally grouped into two sections. we have commands that take effect immediately. These statements is not something that you will use to configure the WSA. It's only for verification. And then we have another group, which is configuration commands. So this is what you will have to commit. So whenever you want to change the interface configuration, or maybe you want to enable a packet capture, or maybe set default gateway, change the host name of the WSA, this stuff you will have to say commit so it takes effect. Versus when you, let's say, take a look at log messages, or telnet, or traceroute, or maybe perform a DNS lookup, those commands, they take effect immediately. Same as the commit command. You don't have to commit a commit, obviously. So as you can see, there are actually a lot of commands that are available on the WSA CLI, but since most of the configuration is going to be done for the GUI, we will just focus on the most important commands, like those that you will use for a basic verification of the config, or maybe those commands that you will be issuing to configure some of the basic settings. Like in case of that initial basic setup of the appliance, you might want to use the etherconfig command, which is how you will modify layer 1, layer 2 interface settings, so stuff like duplex, stuff like speed. Plus, this command is also used to add VLANs, build VLANs, like when you want to use sub-interfaces on the proxy. So it is possible to use a single physical port, P port, like P1, and virtualize it, which is going to be an equivalent of a router on a stick configuration. So you will have to, in this case, build a VLAN, and then the remaining configuration is going to be referring to that VLAN interface and not the physical port. Okay, interface config is how we will change a layer 3 configuration of our interface, physical or logical. This statement is going to be used to access both management and data ports. And then we have our route config statement, which is how we will add IP routes. So for static routing, IP version 4, IP version 6, if you want to add those using CLI, you will have to use this command. The only exception here is when you want to configure a default gateway. In this case, you will have to say set gateway, because the route config, this is going to be used to add routes with a network mask of 1 or higher. So a default route, which is /0, at this one you will configure it with the set gateway option. Okay, basic NTP configuration, and this is done for the NTP config command. Now, in terms of the DNS configuration, which is going to be critical to the proper WSA operations, we have several useful commands. We can definitely want to use the DNS config statement, which is how we will define our DNS servers. Now, this is also what we will do for that initial setup, but what you cannot do for the initial setup and also for the GUI is going to be adding local DNS entries to the WSA's cache, which can be done with the localhost's keyword or this option of this command. So not all keywords are visible when you use a configuration statement. Let's make it clear. I'm going to say DNS config. It shows me several different options, but we don't have the localhost's keyword here. But if I know that this option exists, I can simply say localhosts, and we see that it took the command. It now allows me to configure some additional settings. So there are going to be few commands, few keywords that are really useful and that are not visible in this menu help window. Okay, once again, this command, this option is used to add static DNS entries to the local WSA's cache. We can also clear the cache, like get rid of all of the dynamic entries, like maybe when you change the DNS server configuration, or maybe IP to domain name binding changed. You want to update the DNS information on the proxy. And we can also use the NS lookup or maybe the DIG a command for name resolution verification. Like with NSLOOKUP, this is used to make some basic sanity checks, like what's the IP address, in this case of cisco.com. But if you want to use some more options, some additional options, you would probably want to go for the dig command, which allows you to specify an IP address of the DNS server you want to use for the resolution. Like in this example, I said dig at 1.2.3.4, then specify the domain. It means that I want to query this particular DNS server for the cisco.com domain. And then the last bunch of commands, this is what we will use for verification and basic troubleshooting. Stuff like ARP or NDP, this is how we will take a look at the content of the ARP/neighbor discovery cache. So this is going to show us IP to physical address bindings. And then we've got ping, traceroute, and telnet. This stuff goes without saying. We can use tail. This one is actually a really useful command. The tail keyword, this is how you will access WSA logs. And in most cases, what we will want to look at is going to be access logs. So we can say tail access logs, or you can simply say tail, which is going to get you to the logging menu, where each of the individual log files is going to be numbered. And access logs, in particular, they're always shown as entry number 1. We will be looking at this stuff when we get to the demonstration. Okay, so more commands. We've got packet capture, which is how you enable TCP dump. And then optionally, we can also use some other commands like test our Active Directory communication. We can take a look at WCCP statistics, and finally use the diagnostic command. This one is going to be useful when you want to reboot the proxy engine without having to reboot the entire appliance. So you would say diagnostic, then you would say proxy, and then you would say kick, which is another hidden command. This is how you reload the proxy engine itself. Okay, we will now take a look at the initialization of the WSA, and we will try to match this particular topology. So my WSA is going to be using two interfaces. We have one interface that is used for management, and we have one interface that is used in the data plane. Now the management cloud is separated from the data network, and there is really not a lot of things that we will have to do about this one, but we will have to think about configuring the P interface, which is technically put in VLAN 123. So we will have to think about IP address configuration and about a routing setup. So let's take a look at this. Let's go to the proxy. As you can see, I just logged in. And since I reset the original configuration, this automatically triggered the setup wizard. So I can give it the name for the proxy itself, like what's the WSA system host name. And this is going to show up in the command line interface as the name of the appliance. We can specify addresses of the DNS servers. I'm going to say that our server is 172.16.10.100. It's going to be this device. It is running DNS. Then we will configure NTP server's IP address. I will say the same, 172.16.10.100. And we will have to select the appliance mode of operation, which is all about using cloud web security or using the physical WSA itself, the physical or a logical, like in case of a VM image. There is also a web hybrid mode, in which case you will kind of like combine cloud web security solutions, so the Cisco's WSA cloud, with an on-premise policy enforcement on this particular unit. So we will go for the standard mode, which means that we only want to use this particular WSA. We will not be sending anything to the cloud. I'm going to say next. And then as we will see another option, Another question is going to be about an upstream proxy. Like, do we have a different proxy in our network that we want to use in addition to the WSA? In my case, there is no other proxy, so I'm not gonna check this box. Let's just wait for the device to stop processing this a particular portion of the menu, and I'm gonna say next. We just got to network interfaces and wiring. This is where we will configure our physical ports. So you don't have an option to build some interfaces from the wizard. You don't have that option on the GUI, at least on this particular version of the code. If you want to use sub interfaces, you will have to use the command line. But in our case, I'm just going to say that the management interface is going to be configured with this address. And then for the data plane, we will match the topology. We will give it an IP address of 192.168.123, then 50. So this is going to be address of the WSA on the P1 port. Okay, let's do this. And take a look at the syntax. It uses the CIDR notation. So you'll have to say /24 over here. IP version 6B, don't use it. And then the name of the interface. This is very important because your DNS server is actually supposed to know those names. It is going to be critical for stuff like when you do the redirection for authentication, and also when you do integration with Active Directory. I'm going to say WSAP like proxy and the trainings.com. And we will say use management 1 port for management only. So this option is what enables what is known as split routing. And split routing is all about using two separate routing tables, one for the management port and one for the proxy port. So I want to use M1 for administration only because my data plane is going to be using a different port, P1. So P1 is what we will use to act as a proxy. Okay, we will also have to configure our appliance with a bunch of static routes. But before we get to this point, it asks us if we want to use the T interfaces. So this is for layer 4 traffic monitor. I'm gonna say yes, I wanna use T1 for inbound and outbound communication, even that we will not be using this feature in our sessions. I'm just gonna leave T1 as enabled. You can always change those settings from the GUI when the wizard finishes its job. So since I said that I want to use M1 for administration only, we see that we have two routing tables, management and data plane. This is my M1, this is my P1. Now this is where you can put a default gateway, and I'm gonna do this for P1 interface. I'm gonna say that default gateway is gonna be what device? It is gonna be, I'm gonna say that the default gateway is gonna be configured as this interface, router 2. Because most of the web communication is going to be flowing to 4 or to the test server. So these devices will act as our web servers. So I'm going to say the router 2 is my default gateway. And then I'm going to tell it that to get to this subnet, 172.16.3, we will have to go via router 1. So let's do this. This is the default gateway, 192.168.123.2. And then I will say add a route. I'm going to call it LAN client 172.16.3 with router 1 acting as a next hop. So I need 172.16.3 because this is where I put my client, web client. So WSA must know how to get to the destinations and to the clients in general. This applies to any of the proxy deployment. Okay, I'm gonna say next. I put the wrong IP address on for the next hop to 172.16.3. Let's try to fix this. Let's try to go back one step. Okay, I can change it over here. I'm gonna put 10, and we will now say next. Right, moving on, it asks us about transparent connection settings. It is all about WCCP and transparent redirection. And even that I will be using transparent redirection in our demonstrations, I'm going to configure those options from the GUI. So we will skip this window. Okay, I'm going to give it a password to access the proxy. The username is going to be admin, and this is going to be my password. Put it once again. Then send alerts to what email address? Or let's say send those alerts to me. And then we will disable auto support and network participation. So we don't want to send any type of weekly reports to Cisco, and we don't want to provide an input to the Cisco sender database. I don't want to participate in the statistic gathering to improve the Cisco threat intelligence. Of course, you could do something like this, but you don't really have to. You can also select the participation level if you plan to use it. I'm going to say next. And now what we see here, it's more of like meat and potatoes of the entire configuration, because this stuff is dealing with the so-called control settings, or just individual engines or sub-engines of the WSA. So first and foremost, it says what is going to be the default action for the access policy. Like, do you want to block communication for individual protocols, or do you want to monitor, which in this case is just to log the communication, log the traffic. Next, we have layer 4 traffic monitor settings. So I will also say monitor instead of block. We see that acceptable use controls is by default enabled. This is all about URL filtering and application visibility control. So this stuff I want to have enabled, because in most cases you will be using those engines. Reputation-based filtering, this is talking about WBRS, web-based reputation system. We will talk about the individual engines in a different session, but this one is going to be pretty important, especially for access and decryption policies. We can also enable malware and spyware scanning. You can select individual antivirus engines you want to use. And then Cisco data security filtering, this is for file uploads. Like if you want to control what files, what types of files do you want to allow to go out of the network. So I'm going to use all of the default options. Once again, I want to emphasize it over and over again. Anything you change here, or just you enable here in this basic setup wizard, you will be able to change the decision, change those settings later when you get to the GUI once it finishes installing this configuration. Okay, so this is a summary of the config. Our interfaces, our routes, our control settings. Now I can say install this configuration. And what we should see here is that we will lose connectivity for a second because it redeploys the IP address configuration, including the M1 settings. But when the process is over, I should be able to reconnect to the WSA. All right, in my case, I don't have a local DNS entry. I will just have to put 172.16.5.100. This is IP address of my WSA. So this is address of the M1 interface that I put on the first page of the setup wizard. And we see that I am back. I have pretty much 4 main tabs, what I can use, actually 3 tabs, what I will be using for configuration: Web Security Manager, Security Services, and Network. The system administration, this is what you can use to configure more like global settings, like time config, like enable, disable licenses, like also re-enable the setup wizard. You can also upgrade the proxy and use the policy trace tool, which is an equivalent of the ASA's packet tracer. When you use this feature, it is gonna tell you how a packet with given characteristics that you will have to define, is gonna be processed by the proxy and its engines. And then network is where you can change the configuration of the interfaces, M1, P1, and so on. You can change IP routes, DNS settings. You can enable, disable transparent redirection. This is also where we can enable authentication, add our authentication realm. Security services, this is all about policies. This is where you can specify ports on which the proxy is going to be listing on. This is where you can enable a proxy for HTTPS. This is needed for decryption policies, plus your regular control settings, URL filtering, AMP, and reputation. Then data transfer filters, this is for uploads, plus also some other things like, for example, L4 traffic monitor. And then Web Security Manager, this is going to be our policies. Identification profiles, decryption, routing, access policies. The routing policies, this is not going to be applicable in our case. You would use this one if you are dealing with an upstream proxy. In our case, most of the time that we will spend here is going to be for access policies, possibly identification profiles. This is at least what you would set for the first time. And then you would also probably look at the custom URL categories. And maybe possibly also configure bypass settings, which is how you specify what communication shouldn't be processed by the proxy. So bypass, as we will see in one of the other sessions, that this is actually the first policy that is checked by the WSA. And of course, reporting, this stuff is used for logging and verification.